Imagine finding a uniform hidden for years with your name on it. When you put it on, the emblem glows and a stranger kneels before you, declaring you're the one. This isn't a myth. It's Andon's reality on Varela 3, where rust and memory collide with destiny. What does the spiral symbol mean? And why does it resonate with a code that can't be falsified? The answers lie in vaults waiting decades for his return. But first he must confront a past he isn't prepared to admit. The station's lower levels felt as if they'd been forgotten on purpose. Andon moved through corridors crowded with algae tanks, their green glow reflecting off condensation-slick walls, past silent machines that hadn't hummed in years. Rust streaked every surface, and he found comfort in that decay. It was honest. It made no promises. He preferred it to the idea of revelation. He was rerouting a clogged filtration line when he noticed it, a crate wedged behind a disused coolant exchanger, half buried under frayed insulation rolls. It shouldn't have been there. He knew every storage schematic for this sector. The crate wasn't on any of them. He pried it open with a crowbar. The seal gave with a soft hiss, not of air escaping, but of preservation. Inside, wrapped in a dull gray polymer sheet, lay a uniform. It was pristine. No oxidation tinged its fasteners. No microbial stain touched its fabric, though everything on Varela 3 eventually surrendered to the corrosive atmosphere. He lifted it. The material felt heavier than it looked, a dense weave with a subtle sheen. On the collar, a tag. His name stitched in clean block letters, Andon. He hadn't seen that name in that font in a long time. A feeling like vertigo swept through him, a tumble-down sense of nostalgia for a past he'd deliberately let fade. On the left breast, an emblem, a spiral, elegant and continuous, bisected by a single jagged slash. It looked like a blade had been drawn through a star. He ran his thumb over it. The material was slightly raised, cool to the touch. He changed into it there in the dim light of the maintenance bay. The uniform fit as if tailored for him, which was its own kind of disturbance. The moment the fastener sealed, the spiral emblem began to glow, a soft, persistent pulse of blue-white light. It wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable, a rhythm against his chest, steady, like a second heartbeat. He recognized it, though he couldn't say how. This wasn't just cloth. It wasn't a uniform in any sense he understood. It felt like a key, something waiting for its lock. The glow against his skin was an insistent, silent question. Then movement caught his eye. A shift in the industrial haze drifting from a leaking valve line. A figure emerged from the violet-tinged mist, resolving slowly into something distinctly not human. Long ears, pale yellow hair that seemed to catch what little light there was. She moved toward him without hesitation, her steps silent on the grating. The figure stepped from the violet mist with an unsettling quiet. Her ears tapered to fine points that swept back past her shoulders, and her hair was the color of old parchment, catching the low light like spun glass. She moved without a sound, her steps fluid over the gridded floor as if she knew its every seam. Her clothes were simple, layered, practical, but cut in a style Andon had never seen on Varela 3. She was Valerie, or what remained of one. A people most believed were long gone, or at least quiet enough to be. She didn't pause. She didn't speak. She simply knelt. Her movement was practiced, a smooth descent to one knee. Her head bowed slightly, but her gaze fixed on the glowing emblem over his heart. It was the kind of gesture you saw in historical dramas about forgotten empires. Not in a humid maintenance bay smelling of rust and recycled air. Her voice, when she finally used it, didn't match her youthful appearance. It carried a resonance, a depth that felt aged, as if it had traveled through centuries to reach him. "This symbol," she said, her eyes still on the spiral, "it bears a truth about your identity. It cannot be falsified." Andon took a half step back, his hand coming up in a reflexive, dismissive gesture. People didn't kneel to technicians. On a backwater station like this, they barely looked at you. Disbelief was his first, most honest reaction. This had to be a mistake, a prank, some kind of systems malfunction affecting his own perception. "You're mistaken," he said, the words sounding thin and defensive even to himself. She didn't rise. Her calm was unnerving. "The Calathanor," she said, as if the word explained everything. When it clearly didn't for him, she continued, "It is an old story. A myth, some say. A bearer who once prevented the sky from shattering. A cataclysm so old its name is dust. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. Her own were a startling shade of silver, devoid of doubt. Your identity resonates with the code. The pattern is a match. She said it plainly, a simple statement of observable fact, like noting a pressure reading or a temperature shift. There was no mysticism in her tone, only certainty. That certainty unsettled him more than the kneeling. It created a hairline fracture in the foundation of how he saw himself. His resistance, defensive and immediate, found its form. "I'm not chosen," he stated, his voice firmer now, edged with a bitterness he usually kept buried. "I'm built." It was the core of his self-perception. He was a thing assembled, a construct of parts and programming, engineered for a purpose he'd either forgotten or never known. The uniform with his name on it felt less like a revelation, and more like a component finally being installed. She didn't argue. She didn't try to convince him of destiny or bloodlines. She merely tilted her head, considering his correction. The crack in his self-perception widened just a little. Her silence was an answer in itself. Built or born, the symbol on his chest was still glowing. Her knee was still on the deck. The truth, whatever it was, remained. "For my people, the Calithanor is not a legend," Say said, her voice even, her silver eyes holding his. "It is a historical entry, a person of record." She remained kneeling, not out of subservience Andon realized, but out of a form of deep respect for the symbol itself. There was a cataclysm, an event so significant its true name is lost. We call it the sky shattering. It was not a metaphor. Systems failed. Reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. The Calithanor was the individual who stopped it. She gestured with a slender hand toward the glowing spiral on his chest. This emblem represents both memory and protection. The spiral is the continuity of knowledge, the unbroken line of what must be remembered. The slash through its center is the moment of intervention, the decisive action that cuts across fate to preserve that line. It is a symbol of convergence, a point where many paths meet and one is chosen. According to the traditions of her people, this individual was not a one-time savior. They were part of a cycle. The records state the Calithanor would return when the need was greatest again, not as a literal reincarnation, but as a pattern, a specific configuration of identity, of purpose that would resonate with the old safeguards. Andon's uniform was not a replica or a guess. It was an exact match for descriptions held in Valari archives, texts preserved through both oral histories and encoded digital streams passed down through generations. The fabric's composition, the cut, the placement of the emblem, it all aligned. With a precision that ruled out coincidence. This shifted the entire situation for Andon, moved the problem out of the realm of vague spiritual belief and into something colder, more technical. This wasn't about faith. It was about pattern recognition on a generational scale. Her people hadn't been waiting and hoping. They had been monitoring, watching for a specific signal to reappear in the noise of the galaxy. That signal was now glowing on his chest. The vault network she mentioned wasn't a mythical concept either. It was a physical infrastructure, a series of stations or repositories placed across star systems. They had been dormant, waiting, for decades, perhaps longer. They were designed to remain inactive until they detected the return of this specific identity pattern. The myth was suddenly, uncomfortably specific. It had dates, locations, and technical parameters. It had a uniform. It had a person who argued they were engineered, not born from a prophecy. Say's calm explanation made it all feel more real, and somehow more intimidating than if she had spoken of magic and souls. She dealt in evidence. The emblem was evidence. His resonance with it was evidence. The waiting vaults were evidence. He was standing in a dusty maintenance bay being presented with a case file on himself, one that argued he was the return of a historical figure he'd never heard of. The weight of it pressed down, far heavier than the strange fabric on his shoulders. This was no longer a mistake or a prank. It was a diagnosis. His resistance wasn't just denial. It was foundational. "I'm not chosen," he'd said, the words sharp. "I'm built." That distinction was everything to him. It was the bedrock of his identity, the single fact he held onto in the absence of any other history. He saw himself not as a person born from a lineage or a prophecy, but as a construct, an assembly, something engineered for a specific unknown purpose. Its schematics long since filed away or forgotten. His entire existence on Varela 3 supported that theory. His work was technical, precise. He understood machinery, fluid dynamics, the logic of systems. He could trace a power fault through 3 decks of conduits, but couldn't trace his own family back a single generation. There was no childhood home, no faded photographs, no stories passed down. There was only the work, the rust, and the quiet certainty that he was a tool waiting to be used. The uniform's tag, stitched with his name, didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a label on a component, part of someone else's design, delivered late to the job site. It was further proof of his manufactured nature, not a refutation of it. This belief clashed directly with Say's framework. She spoke of a chosen one, a figure destined by blood or fate, a return of an ancient spirit. He could only offer her the cold reality of a manufactured object. A product. She didn't dismiss his claim. She didn't try to convince him of a soul or a spiritual inheritance. Her silver eyes just considered him, processing the new data point. She adjusted her explanation without missing a beat, seamlessly integrating his self-diagnosis into her ancient parameters. Built or born, she said. Her tone as neutral as a systems report. The pattern matches. The code recognizes you. She reframed the entire spiritual claim into a technical one. It wasn't about destiny. It was about authentication. His identity, however it was created, emitted a specific signal. The vaults were designed to listen for that signal. He was effectively a living key. Her matter-of-fact acceptance was strangely more persuasive than any mystical fervor could have been. It made the impossible concept slightly more palatable, something that could be analyzed and tested rather than just believed. But her pragmatic acceptance came with a cost. It raised a deeper, more disturbing question that echoed in the sudden quiet of the bay. If he was built, then what exactly was he built for? And more importantly, who had done the building? The uniform's emblem continued its soft, rhythmic pulse against his chest, a silent timer counting down to an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. The glow was no longer just a light. It was an indicator of his own operational status, and he had no access to the manual. Say rose from her knee, her movements economical. The time for gestures was passing. "You asked what this means," she said, her voice losing none of its calm gravity. "It means you are expected. The vaults have been waiting." She explained the structure of it then, the shape of the commitment he now wore on his chest. Across several star systems, in dead zones and silent orbits, a network of facilities existed. They weren't military bases or research stations. They were archives of a peculiar kind. Their construction dated back decades, perhaps centuries. They had one purpose: to remain dormant until a specific condition was met. That condition was him, or more precisely, the return of the identity pattern the Valari called the Calithanor. The uniform's emblem was part of it, a necessary symbol, but it was only the first authenticator. The second was his biological signature, the unique resonance of his being that the vaults were designed to recognize. It was a 2-key system, and he was the living half of it. These structures were not simple storage lockers holding historical trinkets. Say described them as interactive memory architectures. They weren't meant to be visited and looted. They were meant to be experienced, to be engaged with. They contained cores, processing units of a sort that had slept for generations. His appearance, the activation of the pattern, was the signal for them to wake. "The first signal already reached us," she informed him, "from the vault on Caltheus. It knows you are here. It has begun its initial protocols." There was no pride in her statement, only fact. His mere existence on this rust-strewn station had triggered a response from a machine light years away. The entire network functioned less like a library and more like a distributed nervous system, a collective brain for historical memory that spanned solar systems. It didn't just hold data. It was designed to interact with the bearer, to impart understanding through a form of guided immersion. This wasn't a treasure hunt for him to undertake. It was an awakening for him to undergo, a curriculum built into the fabric of reality, waiting for its lone student to enroll. The implications settled over Andon, cold and heavy. This was far more organized, far more deliberate than he had imagined. It erased any lingering doubt that this was a mistake. The architecture was too precise, the security too specific. The network hadn't been waiting for a prophecy. It had been waiting for a valid access code, and he was it. The first vault on Caltheus wasn't a destination he had to find. It was an appointment he was already late for. It knew he was coming. The only question was whether he would choose to answer the call. The glowing emblem on his chest felt less like a heartbeat and more like a homing beacon, its pulse synchronized with a clock that had started ticking long before he was ever built. They didn't have a ship. That was the first most practical problem. Varela 3 had a graveyard orbit full of decommissioned freighters, vessels that had been stripped for parts or simply abandoned when their corporate registries lapsed. Andon knew the procedures for claiming one. It involved filing forms with the Port Authority and paying backdocked fees, a process that could take weeks. They didn't have weeks. The signal from Caltheus was a persistent, silent hum in the back of his mind, a sensation he was starting to associate with the glowing emblem. They claimed the Whispering Titan, a blocky cargo hauler that had been drifting for years. Its registration was a tangle of defunct holding companies. Squeeb, a compact service droid Andon had repurposed for station maintenance, handled the data work with a series of amused chirps. "They won't miss it," the droid stated, its vocal emitter giving the words a dry, synthesized tone. "Last listed owner died 3 fiscal cycles ago. The ship is practically a charitable donation." Squeeb's primary function was technical support, but its secondary function was sardonic commentary, a feature Andon had never been able to disable. The ship itself was a study in neglect. Dust coated every surface, and the air inside smelled of stale coolant and ozone. Its AI, what remained of it, didn't speak in clear directives. It muttered. Faint, fragmented sentences would emanate from overhead panels or a console speaker. Snippets of old navigation logs or complaints about hydraulic pressure. It was either haunted by a ghost or just terribly, fundamentally cantankerous. Andon leaned toward the latter. Their dynamic congealed quickly into a makeshift family unit bound by a shared, absurd situation. Say moved through the derelict ship with her same ritual calm, running a hand over dusty control panels as if reading their history. Andon made a quip about the lack of dental coverage in a destiny-saving package. Say merely replied that dental health was rarely a priority in foundational myths. Squeeb injected a necessary levity. As Andon struggled to reroute primary power, the droid observed, "The tea brewer appears to be fully operational. The lava dispenser, however, is malfunctioning. Priority assessment suggests we address the tea." It was a running joke about the ship's bizarre and nonsensical original design specs. The journey out of Varela 3's orbital space was a slow, grinding test of trust. Trust in the patchwork systems Andon had revived. Trust in Say's quiet certainty. Trust that the future unfolding before them was worth the past they were leaving behind. The viewport filled with the static violet haze of the station's outer atmosphere, then suddenly cleared. The haze gave way to the star-filled blackness of open space, deep and silent. They weren't just chasing answers to a riddle anymore. They were building a team, a small, strange crew on a ship that muttered to itself. Caltheus hung in the distance, a speck of light slowly resolving into a gray-brown planetoid. Their destination, the first vault. According to the fragmented charts, the facility was built into a canyon system on the night side. Derelict, haunted, waiting. The Whispering Titan adjusted its course with a groan of protesting thrusters, its old AI mumbling a complaint about gravitational pull as they began their descent. The entrance to the Caltheus vault was not a door, but a seam in the rock, a perfectly vertical slice that hissed open as they approached. The air that sighed out was cold and carried a scent like ozone and dry stone. The space within felt ancient and worse, aware. It wasn't just old. It was observant. The walls were smooth, a dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the impression of infinite depth. The architecture was a seamless blend of the technological and the organic, with conduits that looked like veins and support arches that curved like ribs. There were no visible light sources, yet the chamber was illuminated by a soft, ambient glow that emanated from the walls themselves. A figure detached itself from the far wall. It was a construct, humanoid in shape but clearly not biological. Its form was sculpted from the same dark, non-reflective material as the chamber. Its movements fluid yet precise, utterly without waste. It stopped a few paces from Andon. Its face was a smooth plane, devoid of features except for a subtle, intricate pattern that pulsed with a soft blue light. It spoke. Its voice was a measured synthetic tone, devoid of emotion but not of intent. "Greetings, Calithanor." The title hung in the air, a name that was not his, yet the construct used it without hesitation. It continued, its cadence as even as a metronome. "You are late." The statement was not an accusation. It was a simple correction of a recorded timeline. The vault had been waiting. Its systems had calculated an expected arrival window based on the initial detection of his pattern. He had fallen outside that window. The delay was now a matter of record. The flame's memory must be awakened, the construct declared. It turned an unnervingly smooth motion and gestured toward the center of the chamber. A pedestal rose silently from the floor. At its apex, a disk of silvery metal shimmered, its surface etched with the same spiral and slash symbol that glowed on Andon's chest. It pulsed in time with the emblem, a silent, sympathetic resonance. This was the first core, the memory spiral. The construct made it clear. Andon was not a visitor. He was a participant. His role was to connect, to complete a circuit that had been left open for decades. The architecture around him felt less like a building and more like a dormant nervous system, and the disk was its primary synapse, waiting for the final impulse to fire. Say watched from a respectful distance, her hands clasped before her. Her expression was one of calm expectation, her silver eyes fixed on the scene. She did not look surprised or anxious. She looked like someone witnessing a long-predicted astronomical event, a planet moving into its forecasted alignment. This was the fulfillment of a prophecy she had carried her entire life, and her stillness was a form of deep reverence. Squeeb remained near the vault entrance, its optical sensors scanning the smooth walls and the silent guardian. Its body emitted a low, nervous hum, a sound usually reserved for diagnosing critical system failures. "Atmospheric pressure stable," it murmured more to itself than to them. "No detectable hostile intent. The tea brewer is regrettably not present." The attempt at humor fell flat in the chamber's heavy silence. Andon stared at the shimmering disk. It represented everything that had been thrust upon him. The myths, the expectations, the uncomfortable truth of the pattern he carried. It was the lock and he was the key. He could still walk away. He could return to the rust and the algae tanks and the comfortable certainty of being a simple, built thing. But the emblem on his chest glowed, its pulse a silent, insistent question. He took a step forward, then another. He reached out, his hand hovering over the cool metal surface for a brief moment. He took a final, steadying breath. Then Andon touched the disk. His fingers made contact with the cool metal of the disk. The effect was immediate and total. His vision whited out, not with light but with a torrent of raw sensory data that bypassed his eyes and flooded his mind directly. It felt like a system overload, a cascade error in his own neural pathways. Too much information coursing through a conduit built for simpler things. Cities of light flashed behind his eyes, not images but sensations. He felt the hum of their power grids, the press of crowds moving through crystalline transit tubes, the cool touch of a breeze from an artificial sea. He saw spires that pierced a green-tinged sky, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that glowed from within. He did not see these places. He remembered them. The familiarity was a punch to the gut, deep and undeniable. Voices spoke, a dozen, 100 languages layered over one another. They were not echoes. They were clear, distinct conversations, arguments, whispers. He heard the precise, clipped tones of a military briefing, the soft cadence of a lullaby, the urgent syntax of an engineering report. He did not know these languages, but he understood them. The meaning arrived in his mind fully formed, without the need for translation, as if the concepts themselves were being implanted. It was the understanding of someone who had lived a life where these words were commonplace, a ship resolved from the chaos. It was sleek, long, its hull a matte white that seemed to absorb starlight rather than reflect it. On its side, painted in crisp, bold lines, was a spiral emblem, identical to the one on his uniform but rendered in stark white. The detail was hyper-real. He could see the minute scoring on the hull from micrometeoroid impacts, the subtle variations in the paint's texture. The ship felt profoundly familiar, a known thing, a vessel he had walked through 1,000 times. He knew its layout, the feel of its deck plating under his boots, the specific resonance of its engine hum. It was a memory, sharp and clear, and his. The terrifying realization followed the sensory flood. These were not visions. They were not his imagination constructing possibilities. The clarity, the depth of detail, the sheer emotional weight. This was memory. He was experiencing events, places, and conversations he had never lived through. The cognitive dissonance was profound. His mind struggled to reconcile the linear timeline of his life on Varela 3 with the visceral reality of these recollections. A cold dread settled over him. He pulled his hand from the disk as if burned, staggering back a step. The chamber snapped back into focus, the dark walls and the silent construct. Say watched him, her expression unchanged. His own voice sounded thin and shaken in the quiet. "I think I remembered something," he said, the words tasting strange. Something that didn't happen yet. The idea disturbed his entire sense of time. The past was supposed to be fixed. The future was supposed to be unknown. This was something else entirely. The vault's guardian construct turned its featureless face toward him. Its voice was the same measured tone. "They are not prophecies," it corrected, its phrasing careful. "They are memories." They were seated by the original mind. The distinction was critical. He wasn't seeing the future. He was accessing a past that belonged to someone else, a set of experiences that had been recorded, stored, and were now being unpacked directly into his consciousness. They were not his to have lived, but they were his to know. The vault had not shown him what would be. It had given him a piece of what once was, and the weight of that knowledge settled on him, heavy and irreversible. The Virus-Kel system was a dead zone. It held no strategic value, no resources worth the trip, no governing body to enforce even the most basic laws. It was the kind of place you went to disappear, or to be disappeared. The vault was built into a desolate asteroid, its surface pocked and silent. The approach felt different from Caltheus. The threat here wasn't ancient architecture. It was the profound, watchful silence that surrounded it. It felt less like a historical site and more like a trap. The entrance was another seamless cut in the rock, but the chamber beyond was different. It was smaller, more enclosed. The air was still and carried a faint metallic chill. The guardian construct that formed from the wall was bulkier than the first, its movements more deliberate, its featureless face somehow projecting a sense of cold assessment. It did not offer a greeting. It spoke, its voice a flat, hard tone devoid of the first vault's measured cadence. Companion designation not recognized. The statement was aimed at Say, a blunt rejection of her presence. It shifted its focus to Andon. Submit biological signature for primary access. The demand was absolute. There would be no guided tour here, no polite welcomes. This was a checkpoint. Andon placed his palm on the indicated panel. A pinprick of light scanned across his skin. The construct remained motionless for a long moment, processing. Then, without a word, it simply dissolved back into the wall. A new seam appeared, a vertical line that slid open to reveal a corridor that descended into deeper darkness. The way was open, but the permission felt grudging, conditional. This vault was not about showing him grand, sweeping histories. Its test was more intimate, more invasive. As he moved through the low hexagonal passages, the air itself seemed to grow heavy with memory. He wasn't flooded with visions this time. He was haunted by echoes. He felt the ghost of a decision, a moment of choosing between two impossible options. The weight of command settled on his shoulders, a familiar, unwelcome pressure. He saw, not with his eyes but with a deep internal sense, the consequences of a choice made years, maybe centuries ago. A pattern emerged from the fragments, not just leadership, but leadership forged in loss. A constant, grinding responsibility underpinned by a current of quiet guilt. The fear wasn't of failure, but of repetition, of making the same hard call and watching the same outcome unfold. He stopped, his hand against the cool wall to steady himself. "I saw a possible echo," he said, his voice low. The memory felt sharp, personal, a memory seated by the original mind. It was a moment of watching ships retreat on a view screen, knowing the decision to hold position had cost lives. The emotion was not a historical record. It felt like his own regret. Say, who had remained a silent shadow, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, a counterpoint to the turmoil in his head. She did not dismiss what he felt. "They are not merely haunting you," she said. "They align with your pattern. The memories recognize the shape of you." Her reframing was subtle but significant. She was not telling him the memories were his. She was saying he was built to fit them, that his own nature, the pattern of his being, resonated with these specific echoes of choice and consequence. The vault wasn't punishing him with someone else's past. It was confirming his capacity for a specific kind of future. The guilt was not a burden to carry, but a lesson to understand. The corridor ahead seemed to darken, promising deeper, more personal tests to come. The Sneeze Nebula didn't announce itself with color or beauty. It was a wall of gray, a dense fog that swallowed light and sensor readings with equal indifference. The Whispering Titan's systems began reporting nonsense. The nav screen showed them traveling at near sublight speed while the proximity alert insisted they were motionless, caught in the gravity well of a pocket black hole that hadn't been there a moment before. The ship groaned, its old frame stressed by conflicting gravitational pulls that hiccuped without warning. One moment they were heavy, pinned to their seats. The next they were weightless, tools and loose components drifting in the suddenly still air. It was navigational chaos. Simply holding a straight course was a battle against physics itself. Through the viewport, structures began to resolve from the murk. They were not natural formations. Tall, slender towers rose from the gaseous tides, their silhouettes jagged and broken against the perpetual twilight. They looked like the ruins of a cathedral, its spires toppled and scattered. These were Valeri memory towers. Say identified them with a quiet reverence. They did not store data in conventional terms. They held impressions, sensory echoes of places and people, ghosts in a sense. The entire nebula felt charged with the past, a cemetery of moments that refused to fade. At the nebula's heart, they found the vault. It was a low, dark structure built into the base of the largest tower. The entrance was another seamless cut in the rock. Inside, the air was still and cold. A single pedestal supported a central disk, its surface shimmering with the familiar spiral pattern. It hummed, a low, intent frequency that vibrated in their bones. It felt less like an interface and more like a therapist waiting for a patient to lie down. Andon touched the disk. The gray fog of the nebula, the humming vault, the concerned faces of Say and Squeeb, it all vanished. The environment collapsed and reformed around him in an instant. He stood on a battlefield. The air tasted of ozone and burned metal. The wreckage of small fighters littered a blackened plain under a sickly orange sky. This was not a memory of grand strategy or command decisions. This was a memory of failure. Of a specific terrible moment, a younger version of himself stood a few feet away. His face was smeared with grime, his uniform torn. There was no wisdom in his eyes. Only the raw, desperate shock of someone who had just lost everything. This younger Andon turned, his gaze locking onto the present Andon. There was no confusion, only accusation. The younger man's voice was a cracked, broken thing, but the words were clear and sharp as glass. You let them fall. It was a confrontation, but not with a stranger. It was a confrontation with his own past self, with the raw, unvarnished shame of a decision that had cost lives. The memory was not showing him a history lesson. It was holding up a mirror to a part of himself he had tried to bury. The emotion was not a recorded echo. It was his own, boiling up from a place he thought he'd sealed shut. As the younger version of himself stared, hate and grief warring on his face, another layer unfolded. The memory itself seemed to shift perspective. Andon became aware of other presences in this psychic space, other points of consciousness experiencing their own versions of this therapy. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. He wasn't the only one. The realization cut through his personal anguish. Others had awakened. The network was not for a single user. The memory court was in session, and he was not the only defendant. The ghost of his younger self faded, but the accusation hung in the air, now shared with unseen companions across the stars. Nexus was not a natural satellite. It was an engineered sphere. A perfect geometric shape hung against the void, its surface a mosaic of dark metal and crystalline nodes that flickered with internal light. It looked less like a moon and more like a machine built to contain something vast. As the Whispering Titan approached, the moon did not remain passive. A section of its surface reconfigured, panels sliding back to reveal a docking port that aligned with their ship's trajectory without any course adjustment on their part. The architecture was responding to their presence, anticipating their needs. The air that cycled into the airlock was crisp, odorless, and carried a faint, almost sub-audible hum of immense processing power. Light within the corridors did not come from fixtures. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, bending and shifting to illuminate their path. They were directed to a central chamber, a vast space that defied the moon's external dimensions. The ceiling was not a ceiling but an endless, star-filled sky, the constellations subtly wrong, arranged in patterns that suggested a coded message. Rows of silent, sculpted figures stood in perfect lines, their forms frozen in postures of observation or reverence. One of them, positioned centrally, wore the familiar lines of command armor, its face a blank mask. Andon felt a jolt of recognition so strong it was like vertigo. It was him, or a version of him, cast in silent, eternal vigil. A figure detached itself from the shadows between the statues. It was a construct, its form more refined and less intimidating than the Vault Guardians. Its surface was smooth, pale, and its features were a minimal suggestion of a face. It moved toward them with a librarian's quiet purpose. Its voice, when it spoke, was calm and clear, without the mechanical flatness of the other AIs. "I am the archive," it stated. The librarian. It turned its attention to Andon, its head tilting. "You have activated 5 vaults." The statement was simple, a tally. Each gave you a piece of the original, him, you, the old one. The terms were cryptic, but the meaning was clear. The experiences weren't random downloads. They were curated fragments of an identity, different facets of a single, complex whole being delivered for reassembly. The construct then focused on the emblem on Andon's chest, the spiral that had started it all. "The memory shard bonded to you is more than a key," it explained. Its tone was didactic, patient. "It is a map. It guides your path through the network and assists in the interpretation of the memories you encounter. It provides context where your own understanding fails." The device was not just for opening doors. It was a co-pilot for his consciousness, helping him navigate the torrent of another life. "The process is not always smooth," the librarian added, a note of almost clinical apology in its tone. "Sometimes the core gets stuck in emotional memories. The trauma loops. The grief becomes a feedback signal. I override these instances with narrative abstraction. It is easier on the nerves." The admission was startling. The archive wasn't a passive recorder. It was an active editor of his experience, smoothing the rough, psychologically damaging edges of raw memory into a more digestible story. Then came the revelation that changed everything. "The shard you carry is not singular," the librarian said, its gaze unwavering. The implication hung in the artificially perfect air. Others existed. Other individuals, perhaps across the galaxy, carried similar fragments, were undergoing similar awakenings. They were accessing the same network, piecing together parts of the same shattered history. The mission was instantly reframed. This was not his solitary quest anymore. He was not the only patient in this bizarre therapy session. It was a collective awakening, a distributed effort to remember something too vast for one mind to hold. The weight on his shoulders lessened infinitesimally, the terrible loneliness of his destiny giving way to the daunting prospect of coordination. He was part of a group he had never met, bound by a past they were all struggling to recall. The librarian construct's head tilted, a minimal, calculated gesture. Its next words were not an explanation but a calibration. "The 7th vault will strengthen your bond," it stated, its tone even. Then it added, with a weight that felt different from its previous statements, "The 7th will let you choose." This was the shift. It was no longer about receiving, about enduring the flood of another's life. It was about deciding what to do with it. The payoff was not more knowledge but agency. The 7th vault would present Andon with a choice that would define his future path, a decision on how to wield the identity and power of the Calithanor. This was the transition from student to actor. It wasn't just about memory retrieval anymore. It was a question of identity and governance. What kind of leader would he become with this reclaimed history? Say absorbed the information with her typical pragmatism. Her calm was a steadying force in the face of the monumental decision looming before them. She did not speak of destiny or fate. She simply nodded, her silver eyes assessing the librarian, then Andon, as if already calculating the logistical and political ramifications of whichever path he selected. Her demeanor underscored the gravity of the moment. This was not a personal test, but a choice that would ripple out and shape the lives of others. The future of disparate peoples, perhaps entire systems, might hinge on the decision made in that next chamber. The choice, as the librarian's words implied, was not about submitting to a pre-written destiny. It was about crafting a future. It was the difference between following a map and drawing one. The spiral emblem on his chest, once a symbol of a fixed, returned pattern, now reframed itself around the concept of active choice. The endless coil represented potential, the infinite paths that could be taken from a single point. The slash through its center was the moment of decision itself, the cut that defined a new direction. This realization settled over Andon, cold and clear. He understood the true purpose of the Vault network now. It wasn't just a memory bank. It was a training ground. A crucible, each vault with its specific emotional and psychological challenge, had been shaping him, sanding down his edges, forging his instincts for a specific kind of leadership. They hadn't been trying to turn him into the original. They had been preparing him to be a worthy successor. He was not a copy to be activated. He was a leader being tempered. The destination for this final test was Hades 12. The name alone suggested a volatile environment. Records described a planetoid of obsidian dunes and jagged glass-like spires that pierced a thin, toxic atmosphere. Its weather was notoriously unstable, prone to sudden gravity disturbances and electromagnetic storms that could scramble unshielded electronics in seconds. It was the perfect setting for a trial of will, a physically hostile world mirroring the internal conflict of a monumental choice. The environment itself would be an opponent, a chaotic variable testing his resolve. The obelisks that would await him there were said to pulse in a harmonizing pattern, and one would open to reveal a seat. This was the final interface, the point of no return. The energy arcing through the structures would project star maps, fleet signatures, and intricate pathways of political and military strategy. The very chamber would transform into a projection of the spiral network, the entire galactic stage laid out before him. The weight of that visualization would be immense, the scope of the responsibility terrifying. His acceptance marked by a quiet wry well. No pressure would be the final piece of the transformation, balancing the seriousness of the role with the humor that had always been his ballast. He would be ready not to inherit a title, but to build a coalition. Hades 12 stretched out beneath them, a world carved from obsidian. Great dunes of black glass rose and fell like a frozen sea, their surfaces reflecting the system's distant, weak sun in sharp, painful glints. Jagged spires of some metallic ore thrust up from the dunes, their peaks lost in a thin, green-tinted atmosphere that swirled with constant, agitated weather. The laws of physics felt unstable here. Gravity would hiccup without warning, the ship lurching as if dropped, then settling back to normal a moment later. Lightning, silent and purple, crawled across the sky in slow, branching patterns. It was a planet that felt broken, its fundamental systems corrupted. The seventh vault was the deepest yet, buried under kilometers of volcanic rock. The entrance was a simple archway, unadorned, leading to a chamber that felt more like a throne room than an archive. 7 obelisks formed a ring in the center, their dark surfaces pulsing with a soft, harmonizing light. In the center of the ring, a seat formed from the same material waited. The air hummed with potential energy, the sense of an immense system holding its breath. A figure stood from the central seat. It was not a construct. It was a man. He wore a uniform identical to Andon's, the spiral and slash emblem stark on his chest. His face was Andon's face, but older. The lines around his eyes and mouth carved deep by time and decisions Andon could only imagine. His gaze was direct, assessing, devoid of the memory echoes Andon had encountered. This was not a ghost or a simulation. This was the source. The original was fully present. He looked at Andon, his expression unreadable. "You built all this," he said. His voice was Andon's voice, but weathered, stripped of any uncertainty. The statement was not a question. It was a blunt, factual correction. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the vault, the network, the entire myth of the Kelethanor. He was not accusing Andon. He was stating the architect's simple, terrifying truth. The payoff landed with the force of a physical blow. Andon was not the returned hero. He was the successor, a construct, a carefully engineered continuation built by the man standing before him. The uniform, the name, the pattern, it was all part of a design. A plan set in motion by the original to ensure the work continued. "You are not me," the original said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "You never were." The distinction was absolute. He rejected the idea of reincarnation or a perfect copy. He had not made a duplicate. He had built a new entity, imbued with his pattern, his potential, but destined to make its own choices. He was the blueprint. Andon was the building. "The shards have awakened," the original continued, his gaze intense. "The network is live. Others are remembering. The preparation is complete. He was handing over the controls. His work was done. The next phase, the future itself, was now Andon's to determine. You must choose what comes next. The responsibility was immense, a weight transferred in a single sentence. The original offered one final piece of guidance, a key to unlock the prison of expectation. The past is a blueprint, he stated, his form beginning to flicker slightly like a star at the edge of a horizon. Not a prison. It was permission. The memories, the skills, the hard-won lessons, they were a foundation, a set of tools and warnings. They were not a script to be followed. They were a set of principles to be applied, adapted, and yes, improved upon. This fundamental shift turned the entire journey on its head. It was no longer about imitation, about living up to a perfect ideal from the past. It was about innovation. The original had not created a successor to repeat his actions. He had created one who could learn from his triumphs and his failures, and then do something new. Something better, perhaps. The fading figure of the original offered a final, slight nod, an acknowledgement of the transfer of power, and then he was gone. The seat in the center of the obelisks was empty. The choice and the future belonged entirely to Andon. The 7 obelisks encircling the seat began to pulse in a deep, resonant harmony. Their light intensified, no longer a soft glow but a brilliant, interconnected web of energy. From their apexes, beams of light shot upward, not to the chamber's ceiling but into the projected star field above. The map shifted, transformed. Star systems flickered and resolved into greater detail. Fleet signatures, represented by clusters of shimmering dots and tactical designators, materialized over key sectors. Potential trade routes, old conflict lines, and new diplomatic pathways unfolded across the void, like a complex neural network suddenly brought to life. The entire galactic stage was laid out before him, a vast interactive tapestry of power and possibility. The weight of it was not theoretical anymore. It was a visual, tangible burden. This was no longer a lesson from the past. It was a menu for the future. Every path, every potential alliance or conflict was a choice he was now expected to make. The responsibility settled onto his shoulders, a physical pressure he could feel in his bones. He looked at the sprawling, brilliant display of governance and war, the sheer scale of it, and a dry, quiet comment escaped him. Well, no pressure. The words were wry, almost a sigh, but they were an acceptance. He wasn't refusing the burden. He was simply acknowledging its immense weight with the only tool he had left, a sliver of humor. That acknowledgement was the final, crucial step. He was no longer a man fighting a destiny. He was a leader accepting a job. Say watched him, her silver eyes reflecting the starlight of the projected maps. Her calm was not passive. It was a readiness. She had waited a lifetime for this moment, not for a prophecy to be fulfilled, but for a competent leader to finally take the helm. She braced herself, not in fear, but in anticipation of the work to come. Squeeb, hovering near the chamber's entrance, emitted a low, steady hum. Its scanners were likely cataloging the incredible energy output, but its posture was different. The nervous twitch was gone, replaced by a focused stillness. They were a crew, and their captain had just sat down in the chair. The future was no longer a vague concept they were hurtling toward. It was a thing they would now build together. The chamber began to dim. The obelisk's light faded, their resonant hum dropping to a soft background thrum. The intricate star maps and fleet signatures dissolved back into the simple projection of unfamiliar constellations. The vault had delivered its final test, and he had passed not by making a grand speech but by sitting down and accepting the work. The massive stone door behind them slid shut with a deep final tone. The seam vanished, leaving a smooth, unbroken wall. The 7th vault was closed. Their time as students was over. On his chest, the spiral emblem, which had pulsed with a steady, patient rhythm throughout the entire network, suddenly flared with a new, brighter light. It wasn't the glow of activation or recognition. It was the light of purpose. It was listening again, but now it was also speaking. It was a beacon, and for the first time he understood he was not just receiving its signal, he was its source. People would respond to that signal. His leadership would not be an imitation of the originals. He was a successor, not a copy. He was built from the memories and patterns of the past, yes, but he was uniquely tempered by his own life, by the rust of Varela III, by the dry humor that had gotten him through impossible situations. by the experience of earning Say's trust and Squeeb's loyalty. He was ready to steer, to navigate the narrow channel between galactic conflict and fragile peace. Not because a myth demanded it, but because it was the job that needed doing. The spiral on his chest pulsed once firmly, and the path ahead, though still uncharted, finally felt like his own. He stepped from the final vault, and the silence that met him felt different. The air of Hades 12 was still toxic, the gravity still prone to sudden, sickening lurches, but Andon navigated it with a new steadiness. He no longer felt like a man carrying a borrowed past. The memories were no longer a weight he bore. They were a compass he consulted. He wore them as direction. Say observed the change, her silver eyes missing nothing. Her own posture seemed to relax a fraction, a subtle shift from vigilant guardian to prepared partner. "You're different now," she noted, her voice calm as ever. Andon offered a slight, tired smile. "I'm wearing less panic, that's for sure." The old defensiveness was gone, sanded away by the brutal intimacy of the vaults. His fear had been refined into a quiet, focused awareness. Their conversation on the dusty ramp of the Whispering Titan turned from survival to strategy. They spoke of pathways defined by need, not ambition, of leveraging the network's influence for mercy and stabilization, rather than conquest or control. The old model of a single galactic savior imposing order felt archaic, a flawed design from a different time. Their planning was earnest, a quiet debate over how to build something that could last, something that could function without a myth at its center. Squeeb interrupted the solemn mood with a practical metallic chirp from the hatchway. "Does this mean we get better snacks?" the droid inquired, its optical sensors blinking. "I feel like galactic saviors should have access to premium chips. It seems a basic logistical provision for coalition building." The comment was so perfectly timed, so utterly divorced from the scale of their discussion, that it broke the tension. It became an instant running joke, a shorthand for the absurd contrast between their monumental task and the mundane realities of living through it. Governance, they decided, would definitely need a dedicated snack budget. Beneath the humor, the mood remained serious. The payoff of the entire journey solidified in that moment. The spiral emblem on Andon's chest was no longer just a mysterious heirloom. It had transformed into a dual-purpose instrument. It was a relic, a tangible piece of a history he now understood and respected. But it was also a beacon, its subtle hum an active signal that bound his specific fate to a vast, invisible network of memory and reciprocal responsibility. This network stretched across cultures and species, a web of interconnected histories and shared futures that he was now tasked with nurturing. The memory spiral's internal circuits vibrated with a low, constant potential, a feeling like a live wire encased in cloth. It was clear the system's purpose was never to create a single solitary hero to rule from on high. The architecture was distributive by design. The network would extend its influence through coordination and communication, not central command. The challenge was no longer about unlocking his own past. It was about the far more complex and delicate work of coalition building across disparate star systems. It was about listening to 1,000 different needs and finding the pathways where they could align. He looked from Say's patient expectancy to Squeeb's hopeful query about snack procurement, then out at the jagged, hostile beauty of the obsidian wastes. The scale of it was still terrifying, but the panic was gone, replaced by a sense of grim, capable resolve. The work would be endless. It would be fraught with missteps and negotiations and compromises, but he was no longer a technician hiding in the rust. He was a focal point. The spiral on his chest pulsed once, a silent acknowledgement of the task ahead, and for the first time, the pulse felt like a promise he was capable of keeping. The airlock of the Whispering Titan sealed on Nexus for the last time. The Archive Moon's docking port retracted, its surface reconfiguring back into a seamless dark sphere as they pulled away. New coordinates glowed on the nav screen, not for another vault, but for a system on the edge of known space where distress signals tangled with old Volari frequency markers. They weren't following a map of memory anymore. They were charting a course by need. On the bridge, the spiral emblem on Andon's chest maintained its soft, constant pulse. But its function had changed. It was no longer just a receiver, a thing that glowed when near a lock. It was a transceiver now. It was listening again, actively parsing the data streams and carrier waves that bled through the void, and it was broadcasting a subtle, encoded response. And people were starting to answer. Faint, encrypted replies flickered at the edge of their comms, signals of recognition from individuals and groups who knew the pattern, who had been waiting for it to wake up. The network was no longer a one-way street. It was a conversation beginning in the dark. Andon watched the star line stretch, his posture in the command chair no longer that of a passenger on a predestined road. He was poised not as a mythic legend returned, but as a directed leader. The weight of the title Calithanor had settled, but it felt less like a crown and more like a set of coordinates for a job site. The grand galactic destiny had been broken down into a series of practical problems to solve, alliances to broker, and fires to put out. He was a foreman for a reconstruction project that spanned solar systems. "We'll go where we're needed," he decided aloud, his voice calm. The statement was simple, but it was the core of the new compact. It was an active choice, a rejection of a fixed path in favor of responsive action. It was the difference between being a monument and being a mobile response unit. Say stood beside his chair, not behind it. Her role had completed its evolution from guide to partner. She monitored a secondary screen, her fingers tapping lightly as she cross-referenced the incoming signals with Valeri historical databases. Her knowledge was no longer offered as revelation. It was provided as tactical intelligence. They debated the merits of the next course adjustment with the easy shorthand of equals, a mutual respect forged in the strangeness of the vaults. The dynamic was no longer leader and follower. It was a pilot and a navigator sharing the same console. Squeeb's humor provided the necessary ballast. As they discussed the political volatility of the Tereki system, the droid observed from its charging port, "Their primary export is cryo-stored seafood and industrial solvents, a combination that suggests either fantastic catering or spectacularly bad decisions, perhaps both." The comment was so ludicrously specific and yet utterly unhelpful that it broke the tension. Andon found himself smiling, the grim focus of command tempered by the absurd reality of the universe they were trying to steer. In uncertain times, a running joke about governance and snacks was a stabilizer, a reminder not to take the prophecy too seriously even while doing the work. The galaxy, for its part, was still learning to trust the spirals turning. The emblem represented an old power, a history of intervention that was as much feared as it was revered in the fractured systems they moved through. Theirs was not a victory tour. It was a delicate diplomatic mission layered on top of an emergency response operation. They weren't hailed as saviors upon arrival. They were met with scanned, silent scrutiny, with encrypted queries and guarded communications. Trust would be earned, not inherited, built slowly through action and proof. This entire journey, from a rusty maintenance bay to the bridge of a ship charting its own course, had one central payoff. It argued that identity isn't a stamped certificate you're born with, or a status handed down. It is discovered. It's forged in the interaction between the self and the systems, both technological and mnemonic, that it encounters. It's solidified through the choices made when no one is watching, and the relationships built when the path gets dark. Andon was not important because of who built him or what pattern he matched. He was becoming who he was through the decisions he made at this console, in conversation with his partner, with a droid muttering about seafood in the background. The uniform may have been waiting for him in a crate, but the man wearing it was his own invention. The vaults are behind them now, their silent lessons integrated into a new operational reality. Andon's journey doesn't end with the unlocking of the final door. It simply changes its terms of engagement. The work shifts from retrieving history to navigating its complex living aftermath. The activation of the network sent out a signal, a ripple through the deep time communication systems of the galaxy. And like any powerful broadcast, it gets picked up by all kinds of receivers. Some of those receivers are allies. They emerge from silent observation posts, cloistered monasteries on ice moons or hidden enclaves within bustling space stations. They carry their own fragments of the pattern, their own shards of memory. They recognize the authority of the spiral not as a command to obey, but as a call to collaborate. They offer information, resources, and sometimes just a quiet confirmation that the work is worth doing. Others who intercept the signal are threats, mercenary fleets who see the reawakening network as a vulnerability to exploit, rogue factions who interpret the Calathanor's return not as a chance for unity, but as an opportunity to seize the network's power for themselves. The myths surrounding the symbol are not uniformly positive. In some sectors, it represents a brutal unifying force from a darker time, and its return is met with fear and hostility. Every new system they enter requires a fresh assessment of friend or foe, a constant recalibration of diplomacy and defense. The memory network itself is not a static database they can simply consult. It's a dynamic, almost organic system that requires active maintenance and careful interpretation. It's prone to corruptions, to emotional feedback loops where traumatic memories can overwhelm the core systems. Andon finds his technical skills are not obsolete. They are more vital than ever. He works with SE to stabilize volatile memory cores, to reroute data flows around damaged sectors, to interpret the often cryptic warnings and historical records the network provides. It's a constant process of translation, turning the raw ancient data into actionable intelligence for the present. This is where their partnership solidifies into its final form. SE's deep Valeri knowledge provides the cultural and historical context for the network's output. She can identify a forgotten treaty clause buried in a memory stream, or recognize the significance of a family sigil on a derelict ship. Andon's technical mind takes her context and turns it into a plan. He can patch a failing power conduit in a memory tower, or jury-rig a communication array to send a targeted warning to a system on the brink of conflict. They are two halves of a single operational unit, her wisdom informing his actions, his practicality grounding her insights. Through it all, Squeeb remains their anchor to the immediate and the mundane. As they debate the geopolitical implications of a newly awakened vault on a border world, the droid will interrupt to report a malfunction in the ship's hydration reclaimer, or to demand a formal inquiry into the persistent lack of premium snack options. A stable coalition requires stable blood sugar, it will insist, its tone utterly serious. This relentless focus on practical concerns is not a distraction. It's a necessary tether, preventing their mission from floating entirely into the abstract realm of myth and memory. It reminds them that they are still just three beings on a ship, and that ship needs to be fueled and its crew fed. The spiral emblem on Andon's chest no longer glows with the urgent pulse of discovery. Its light is steadier now, a constant low hum of connection. It pulses subtly when a new signal is detected, when another shard bearer makes contact light years away, or when a distant vault reports a status change. It is a living map of a waking network, and he is its central node. The lasting impact of this ongoing journey is the quiet understanding that identity is not a preloaded program or an inherited title. It is a process. It is discovered daily through the choices made at a navigation console, through the interactions with allies and adversaries, and through the constant, careful work of interpreting the past to serve the future. Andon was built with a pattern, but the man he becomes is forged in the doing. They navigate the narrow channels between open conflict and fragile peace, not with the arrogance of prophecy, but with hard-earned wisdom. Every decision is weighed against the echoes of past mistakes held within the network. They learn to offer aid without imposing control, to mediate disputes without taking sides, to be a stabilizing presence rather than a conquering force. The myth of the Calithanor, a story once set in stone in ancient texts, is evolving in real time. It is becoming a living history, written by their actions. It is no longer about a single savior who stops the sky from shattering. It is about a small, dedicated team that patches the leaks, reinforces the structures, and helps a fractured galaxy remember how to talk to itself. Their makeshift family, the built leader, the Valari historian, the snack-obsessed droid, becomes the foundation for something broader. They are the proof that unity doesn't require uniformity. It just requires a shared commitment to keeping the lights on and moving forward. One repaired system, one negotiated truce, at a time. Andon's journey argues that identity isn't a discovery but a construction project. He was not a hero found but a leader built, choice by choice, memory by memory, in the space between what he was given and what he decided to do with it. The spiral emblem on his chest never represented a fixed destiny. It was always a compass, a map of potential pointing toward who he might yet become. Not a prophecy, but a set of directions. One final thought. What uniforms, what unseen maps to another self might be waiting in your own forgotten crates?